You're about to see why so many of our recovery interventions are actually harmful to our gains. Whether it's growth, strength, fat loss, it doesn't matter. I did it myself, but we are shooting ourselves in the foot with so many of these popular recovery interventions. We got to stop this. I did it myself. I really want to help you fix this one. It is really, really common in the industry. This is the kind of thing I talk about in the book, Massive Muscular Arms, published by Human Kinetics. And it's time to jump forward about 20 years in terms of our knowledge and subsequent application. So let's jump into the clip from the Iron Radio podcast.
All right, we're back. It's Mike and Phil and Lonnie, and we're with David Barr, who is an industry insider and author and scientist, and we're just going to pick his brain a little bit about the concept of recovery. I know it's something you've looked at for a long time, David, and on Mike's suggestion, a good one, I think, let's start by just the definition of recovery.
That is so important and so fundamental, and yet so infrequently done that it has created a lot of problems in our industry. And I think that understanding and subsequently applying recovery is the number two, the second biggest opportunity we have right now in our industry in terms of things that we can turn on a dime and implement right away. So I would submit that right now we're going in the wrong direction, and my goal is to, again, advance the field by helping people understand what they're doing and why. So with regard to recovery, the very simple answer is recovery is a return to baseline, a return to zero after some kind of induced deficit. Mm-hmm. And this is universal. It doesn't matter if it's fitness, it doesn't matter, if it's performance. This extends to everything. So we can look at data recovery. Let's say you drop your cell phone and you can't access your data. You have zero data. You take it to a data recovery center. Now, what is the best case scenario for them to recover your data? Is it to get 100% of your data back or to get 150% of your data back? What the hell is 150% of your data? Like they're going to put stuff on your phone? Like that's not cool, right? Recovery is a return to zero and not going beyond. And we can look at this with medicine too. Say you break your arm. What is the best case scenario? You break your arm. Are you trying to get super bones? This is not the way to get an adamantium skeleton, right? The best case scenario is that your bone will heal back to the strength it was before the break. It's getting back to zero. And the reason this is so important for what we do in the fitness performance industry is because we are not training to get to zero. We don't give all that time, all that effort to stay the same. We want to adapt. We're trying to get better, bigger, faster, stronger, get leaner, go longer, whatever our goals, we want to go beyond. So by focusing on recovery and not understanding that there's a difference when it comes to adaptation, we are often shooting ourselves in the foot and inappropriately applying so-called recovery interventions, which may in fact get us back to baseline quicker, but again, shoot ourselves in the foot, hurt our gains in meathead parlance. So that is the general overview.
One of the things that I always think about, just as someone who's just lifted for ages and then learned about powerlifting more and more over the years from Phil, is oftentimes the bodybuilding definition of recovery is metabolic and muscular. And in powerlifters, there's much more of a neural component, I think. Is that fair, Phil? Like, what's your take on when you hear recovery? Do you think neural first? Do you think muscle first?
Usually neurally. I can feel muscularly erect and still have some of the best days, So it's more rested and just neurally ready to go. Like that's really what we're trying to do. Like if I'm peaking somebody for a meet, is not only get them, recovered on the muscular level, but more importantly on the just ready to perform. Just rested and the whole system is just ready to go and itching to get on the platform. So
yeah. Mike, when I was mentioning the gene therapy thing, the first thing that, like your example that you kind of defaulted to first was performance. I mean, how vague. I mean, defining this stuff is such a big deal. Define performance. Because my default was hypertrophy. Or even dietary stuff. Like defining stuff it's one of the problems I think that politicians have such a hard time. They want to define things. They can't even agree on. Oh man, I'm not even going to touch some of these words, but they can't even agree on one thing. A Republican will look at something and say that's a car, and a Democrat will say, "What are you talking about? That's an apple." I mean, they're not even in the same universe, And so, how can we ever come to some compromise? There's unless we want an apple car hybrid. But I run into that. I just read a paper about they were having to define red meat. Mike, you and I have talked about that. We walk around at posters like. Red meat? What do you mean by that? Or I was looking at a paper about the Mediterranean diet, and that's actually harder to define than you might think. There's a lot of nuances there. Or coffee, So deciding on what we're talking about, I think, is a big deal. But what about your experiences with recovery yourself, Mike? Like, what's your initial gut reaction if somebody comes to you and says, "Man, I can't recover"? What's your response?
Yeah, Dave was the first guy I met who was like, "Well, what do you mean by recovery?" And I'm like, "Just the ability to do the same thing again sooner." So just trying to get back to baseline. So if it's a client and they're saying, "Oh, my recovery is not very good," I'm not going to try to get them to define recovery because they probably have no idea what they're even talking about. Mm-hmm. So then I'm going to ask them, okay, so what is usually I'm going to look into performance first. Does this mean that you train 3 days a week and you want to train 4 or 5 days a week? What is the thing that you're actually complaining about? And that may be they just have their program as just this haphazard, poo soup of a bunch of stuff they threw together. So we may not have to do any, quote, recovery stuff. We just may have to give them a decent design program. And now they can do, more work. And after that, you could get into just nutritional components or sleep. I use a lot of heart rate variability to look at stress, to see what's going on there. And those are the hardest questions to answer, too, right? Because you'll get kind of non-clients or people on the newsletter who have a good question. They're like, my recovery is not very good. What do I do? Like, oh man, that could be, that could go like so many different directions. And you have just a laundry list of questions to follow up to see what's actually going on. Because I think the word recovery at this point has been so bastardized that people understand what you mean. And I think they kind of automatically go to supplement sales and things of that nature. But it can be a quite involved, messy conversation pretty fast.
Yeah, I mean, this is where, I'm usually, when people ask, and this came up recently with some students, when they ask, like, what books should I read? And usually the default when you listen to podcasts or YouTube or whatever, you could think of some lay books, and some of them are damn good. But my default is usually, well, let's start with a basic, like, exercise phys 101 kind of book, so you can lay down, like, for example, in this situation, what about a systems approach? There's musculoskeletal, there's endocrine or immune or neural. And if it's neural recovery, is it more peripheral? Is it CNS? And or are we talking about psychology and you're just feeling burnt psychologically?
Guys, I got to say, this is such a fantastic discussion. You guys brought up every point I wanted to address. And I think it says a lot about why we've been friends for, 15 years now, which is kind of scary. But everybody's spot on, perhaps unsurprisingly. Yeah, so let's take the systems approach. My entire world is systems-based. Again, going back to the whole Aspie thing, it's I almost don't know. I'm too stupid to think differently. So you're spot on. Nervous system, what's often referred to as CNS recovery, it is typically distinct. And when we focus on nervous system recovery, we are really mostly focused on actual recovery, getting back to baseline. And why is that? Because They're often deficits induced by our natural lifestyle. And we can see this with, as Mike mentioned, heart rate variability. Maybe we're super stressed out in terms of psychosocial stress. Maybe we're sleep deprived. No, not maybe. We are sleep deprived, right? So how do we get back to normal in terms of sleep to facilitate that normal recovery? Again, because it's at a deficit. When it comes to skeletal muscle, that's where things tend to go off the rails. And that's where we tend to want to change our natural physiological processes. We want to interrupt them. And it's what I call worry words. We have words that we think we have a good understanding of, and we misapply them. And you don't see this in Russian or other languages. It's a consequence of our me-centric language and society, which is not a criticism. I'm not trying to promote communism here. I'm trying to illustrate, give you some background as to why this has happened. So we can think, for example, stress. Everybody knows what stress is. Stress is bad. We want to get rid of stress. So now I'm a meathead in the industry. I'm going to give you ways to get rid of your muscle stress to improve recovery. Well, wait a minute. The entire point of working out is to induce stress so that the body will subsequently adapt. We don't want to hinder that. And often that happens through, say, inflammation. Oh, inflammation's bad. Everybody knows. Well, no, inflammation is necessary. We need it for adaptation. It's when it gets out of control in medical situation, it's chronic. That's when we want to blunt it. But again, that is medical. In a normal, healthy situation, when we are looking for adaptation recovery, we want to allow that inflammation to occur. Same thing, antioxidants, whatever it is.
Yep.
There are things that we want to maintain. We want to facilitate the body's natural processes rather than trying to blunt them. Stick a pin in that.
We had talked in the past, and it comes up every year practically, about using antioxidants. How much does the body's endogenous antioxidant enzyme systems cope with training, glutathione peroxidase or SOD or whatever, and then, but then you take too much antioxidants and, maybe you blunt strength gains or you blunt some aspect. And I know, Mike, that's kind of your thing a lot, is whether it's cold exposure or stressors, like toy with stressors. And because the brilliance of the human body, I think, is it's a dynamic machine. It's not a car engine that just breaks, but it morphs, right? I mean, so you take that almost engineering approach, I think, right?
Yeah, and then you can go one step further and look at, anti-fragility, right? Because the body, and Dave's talked about this too, is that you adapt to stress and you get back to baseline. But what you really want is you want to get a little bit better than your previous baseline, right? Which is something that is anti-fragile. You're actually getting systematically better over time by the intelligent application of stress. If you remove all that stress, like we send someone up into the space station, just removing of gravity, you see, massive bone loss and muscle loss if they don't do anything to counteract that.
Thanks to the Iron Radio team, Dr. Lonnie Lowery, Dr. Mike T. Nelson, and Phil Stevens. If you're looking for more recovery or training tips to get massive muscular arms, head over to armbar.com, check out the book while you're there. Thanks for watching. I'm David Barr, and until next time, raise the bar.